Okay, so everyone, welcome to our webinar today. And today we have our speaker, Dr. Geoff Boeing. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis at the University of Southern California's Sol Price School of Public Policy. And he is also the director of USC's Urban Data Lab. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Previously, he was an assistant professor of urban informatics and planning at Northeastern University. He received his PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and completed a postdoc in Berkeley's Urban Analytics Lab. Professor Boeing's research revolves around city planning, urban form, data science, and urban informatics. Recent projects have focused on, first, the nature and character of urban street networks around the world, and second, how spatial technologies and their data shape housing markets and our understanding of affordability. His recent research has been published in journals across scientific and policy disciplines, including the Lancet Global Health, the Journal of the American Planning Association, Applied Network Science, Geographical Analysis, Environment and Planning A and B Frontiers in Neurology, and Urban Design International. He developed and maintains the very famous OSMNIX street network modeling software. So we are very lucky to have Geoff to give a webinar for us today. During the webinar, and for all of our audience, please feel free to ask questions through Q&A. You can also raise up your hand. You can also raise up your hand at the end of the talk. Also, at the end of the talk, if you would like to further engage with Geoff in a conversation, I can also promote you as a panelist, or I can allow you to directly speak. So you can directly type in your Q&A if you would like to be promoted as a panelist or to speak. Okay, so without further ado, let's welcome our speaker, Dr. Boeing.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. So,
yes, I can see it.
Thank you to UCGIS for having me here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about transport in the context of urban informatics, and specifically a couple of recent projects where I and also a team of collaborators have worked on measuring street networks and accessibility around the world. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly unpack this idea of urban informatics and consider some of its linkages with transport geography and planning, and then think a little bit about why and how we study street networks, and particularly how they structure the built environment, how they shape sustainability and public health through access. And then I want to discuss some recent research projects. So there'll be three kind of intertwined projects there at that intersection of informatics, transport, and access. And then I want to conclude with a call to arms that I've kind of been trying to make recently in a lot of the talks and papers that I've been writing, that we need better tools that embody the right theory, so geographic theory, urban theory, to be able to conduct better science. And I'm going to argue that this kind of tool building is a key opportunity today, both in urban informatics and in transport geography, and really in geographic information science broadly. But to start things off, I want to think a little bit about urban informatics to frame all of this. So urban informatics is the sort of ill-defined but multidisciplinary approach to understanding, planning, and managing cities. It specifically focuses on computing and information technology. And it triangulates between urban planning, spatial sciences, and computer science. It has a lot of overlaps with GIS and with statistics. It also covers a lot of information processing, storage, wrangling, kind of data science side of stuff. And these ideas have a long history in regional science, but there's been a lot of new work recently in social physics and urban physics, bringing new methods and new perspectives into this space. And today, urban informatics could be seen as both a basic science and an applied science. So on one hand, it aims to create these new theoretical understandings, but on the other hand, it's often used in practice and applied ways for urban operations of managing and monitoring the city. On that applied front, this sometimes takes promising and sometimes prosaic, but sometimes pernicious forms. On the promising side, urban informatics promises these better understandings of cities and more efficient cities, which is particularly great if we could try to serve marginalized communities in new ways. But too often it ends up just being prosaic at best or pernicious at worst, because instead it often becomes just yet another vector for the same old surveillance and control and policing. In recent years, the literature has seen a lot of important critiques about urban informatics fetishization of method, putting the data or the tool ahead of the question. And it's also witnessed a lot of concerns about privacy and ethics in this space. And there's a critical tension here between the descriptive teleology of data analysis versus the theory building aims of science itself. I think that transport is a key opportunity area for urban informatics today, because it really speaks to a lot of its strengths, including a better understanding of quantifiable phenomena, being able to create dashboards and alerts for practitioners to be able to have quicker interventions into important spatial problems. But it has its weaknesses too. So not everything is quantifiable, but too often there are these grand claims about solving the city through technology or the right algorithm. But there's an important question here of, can it really address wicked problems, or just keep plucking the low-hanging fruit when we're trying to apply tech and information processing to the deep fundamental challenges that cities face? But along that idea of there being an opportunity here, I think there are a couple key ways that we as academics and practitioners, but particularly as fairly tech-savvy people, can try to intervene into this space for the better. First is helping to close the skills gap. And I think that's an important goal for us as academics. We've seen a lot of new Master of Science programs, a lot of new research centers and institutions at universities opening up over the past few years, trying to develop that skill base to provide industry with a new crop of well-equipped, with both theory and methods, practitioners. And the second thing of that is it's kind of incumbent upon us to be not just consuming, but generating better data and tools for better empirical science, and in turn, evidence-based practice across any of our spatially adjacent fields, but in my case today, in the urban space. So to think about that a bit more, in the context of transportation planning, I think this is a key area of promise for the scientific side of urban informatics, because much of transportation is an information problem. It's about information for the citizen about accessibility, arrival times, and traffic congestion. It's about information for the planner about current network utilization or system resilience. And it's also been a huge growth area for user-generated data. So everything from GPS traces to transit card taps to volunteer geographic information, such as OpenStreetMap, which you can see here in this screenshot, where we can crowdsource knowledge of the urban form, and particularly transportation features. And that latter point will be my focus today. So thinking about this idea of network form and what it means for sustainability and accessibility. And I will focus less on the applied mission control side of urban informatics and tech, and more on that basic science side of trying to understand cities and their planning through new kinds of spatial data and technology. And to frame that, I want to think a little bit about street network form here. By form, I mean some combination of the geometry and the topology of street networks. So street network form underlies urban mobility, the movement of people and freight, the physical fabric that connects different communities to each other. And in conjunction with land use and urban design, it determines accessibility for the people living in the city. So, why study street network structure? I like to use these examples just to try to demonstrate how important and different street networks are to our conceptualization and use of urban space. So here we can see 4 networks all at the same scale of 1 square mile, and their pattern and texture and grain reflect different transportation technologies, different design paradigms, politics, expressions of power, underlying terrain, local culture, and economic conditions. For example, you can consider the histories and values embedded in the classic grid, from Hippodamus's early urban design work in ancient Greece to the Law of the Indies, to the US Homestead Act and the New York Commissioner's Plan. The grid has been used for millennia to express a certain human order over the landscape, or to organize transportation around spaces of power, or to make land more amenable to real estate speculation and development. Or consider Haussmann's renovation of Paris in the 19th century and its planning goals, or the autocentric form of different US Sunbelt cities, and the notions of lifestyle, aspiration, privilege, or exclusion that have been deliberately planned into certain types of cities and suburbs around the world. And in particular, all of these different street network patterns here demonstrate varying levels of connectedness, accessibility, compactness, resilience, and sustainability. And if we add in building footprints or land parcels, demographic data, points of interest, we can start thinking about household accessibility to jobs, schools, stores, and other kinds of daily living needs. Now, transportation planning has restructured urban networks over time. And as it's done so, it's redistributed access and in turn equity for different groups. And transportation planners have studied networks accordingly for years. But today, we can evaluate the outcomes of these transportation plans through new tools of urban informatics, network science, and computation. And to do that, I kind of want to walk through examples of 3 recent projects that I have worked on to measure built environments through those transportation networks. And all of those projects have relied on OpenStreetMap for at least part of their source data, which kind of solves the problem of how to acquire street network data consistently, in particular around the world. So if you're not already familiar with it, OpenStreetMap is a public mapping platform and a worldwide collaborative geospatial database. It has spatial boundaries, streets, pedestrian paths, bike lanes, building footprints, and amenities, as you can see here in this image from it. Its data are also pretty high quality, with some heterogeneity, where big cities and usually wealthier countries have better data coverage. But if we were to compare it to something like the Census Tigerline shapefiles in the US, it tends to be pretty high quality. But the challenge is often that for an end consumer, the data can be somewhat hard to extract, particularly in a usable form, and even more particularly in like a nice graph theoretic form to be able to do topological network analyses on it. So into that mix, a few years ago, I developed a Python package called OSMNX for downloading any geospatial data from OpenStreetMap and then building models, particularly of spatial networks, to do urban analysis from OpenStreetMap data. You can easily, with a single line of code, model cities, neighborhoods, boroughs, counties, states, nations, and then with another line of code, calculate statistics, simulate trips, etc. on it. You can also bring in elevation data, which is really important for helping us model street grades, sea level rise, and develop better impedance functions to understand and model active transportation, which tends to incorporate information about elevation change, much more so than most driving models do. So using that tool and these kinds of data, I recently worked on 3 projects that asked questions about the evolution over the past century of American street network design. Secondly, expanding that to try to better understand mobility networks and their characteristics around the world. And then thirdly, looking at benchmarking and scorecarding spatial outcomes, particularly in the context of public health and accessibility. So for that first question, this was really motivated by this ongoing challenge in urban planning that after a century of shaping American cities around the spatial logic of the car, urban planners today are struggling to address climate change. They face public health crises from physical activity and environmental pollution. And at the same time, planning scholars and prominent practitioner groups have highlighted for the past few decades the links between urban form and each of these crises. And they've called for a return to more traditional land use patterns and street network designs, such as the traditional street grid, that more easily allow active travel and greater freedom of mode choice. But a key question here has remained: how have American planners actually responded to these calls? Do we see any shift toward those goals in street network form? So for this project, I modeled the street network of the entire US at multiple scales, including each city, urban area, county, census tract, and Zillow-defined neighborhood. And then at each of those scales, I calculated several indicators. And then finally deposited the models and indicators in an open data repository for other people to reuse. So the first thing I did here was I looked at the US's 74,000 census tracts, here visualizing just the contiguous US, to better understand connectedness, compactness, and the sustainability of network form for travel. Here I'm visualizing a grid index. It's a composite index that I developed for the study. We can chat more about those methods at the end if that's of further interest. But when it's visualized here, you can very quickly start to see the spatial legacies of 19th century expansion across the United States. So the most grid-like census tracts here kind of scatter across the Great Plains and the Midwest, which were very rapidly developed around the logic of railroad travel to these places that were at the time on the frontier. And were laid out very quickly for rapid real estate development and speculation around the consistent grid. We can also see the sort of archipelago of urban areas that are gridded around the rest of the US. And when you see this, you might hypothesize other covariates such as topography, era, the role of suburbanization. And we can start trying to unpack some of these characteristics over time. In this figure, I'm showing a snapshot of characteristics today of urban street networks that were built in different eras. So this is kind of scorecarding the spatial outcomes of urban form planned at different times. Here I've estimated tract vintage from census structures built data and property transaction and assessor records. And across all of these different variables, you can see a consistent trend that kind of makes up a consistent story here. So we see this trend toward increasing sprawl in the post-war era, until a small reversal in the past 2 decades, where we are starting to see, in the past 20 years, some return to those more traditional street network form patterns. And this is important because as urban planners, network form lasts for centuries, often millennia. So it's really important to get it right the first time. And while this measures our progress toward more sustainable forms and perhaps freedom of mode choice in the US, this project also raised an important follow-up question about what about in rapid developing countries? So I was inspired by that project to expand from US street networks to look at worldwide urban areas. where frankly, a lot more of the action is today. So for the second project, I modeled the street network of every urban area in the world using boundaries that were derived from the global human settlement layer, which helped overcome a few past challenges. So first, defining consistent study sites worldwide has always been tough because of the differences in how different countries talk about and represent urban areas or municipalities. So using the global human settlement layer was helpful because it defined a consistent quantitative methodology to define those urban rural peripheries. Second, the study was able to use fairly consistent data around the world, and at least consistently defined data from OpenStreetMap. We'll talk more about that idea of consistency and the importance of validation later. And then it modeled and analyzed all of these graphs using OSMNX. We calculated node elevations and edge grades for every urban area, and then again calculated a bunch of street network indicators for each of them to conduct a descriptive analysis. And then all of the code and models and indicators were again put into a public repository for reuse. So just to briefly summarize some of those empirical findings here, in this graphic, I've modeled some of the fundamental relationships in these different places. So the background for this is that in recent years, urban science has been hypothesizing and theorizing a lot of these fundamental relationships. So kind of the basic characteristics of cities. A lot of it is derived from like the urban economics literature, thinking about returns to scale and phenomena like that. But one of the challenges in the urban science literature, so that the literature deriving from kind of applying statistical physics to cities, one of the challenges has been the sample size. So very often we'll see these theories being hypothesis tested against a sample of 10 European cities or 30 American cities or 40 large cities around the world. And what they all share in common is this sort of convenient sample where we were able to find these kinds of data for a certain set of cities. And so that's what got the hypothesis tested on it. But what I was interested in doing here was trying to expand that theory building to look at the population level data of all the urban areas in the world. So here I estimated these relationships across the roughly 8,000 urban areas defined by the global human settlement layer. And a couple interesting phenomena here to pick out. The first is that infrastructure scales sublinearly with population, which theoretically makes sense, right? So residents can share infrastructure. So more residents are able to increasingly efficiently share the same amount of infrastructure. And I found here that a 1% increase in population is associated with a 0.9% increase in total street length. As the elasticity, and a 0.95% increase in intersection count. And across all of these urban areas, the average street length per person is about 2 meters, but a $10,000 US dollar increase in per capita GDP was associated with roughly a 1 meter increase in per capita street length. Now, of course, these aren't causal models, and it's not suggesting a direction of association here, rather just looking at those descriptive correlations between these different features around the world. So following on that project of trying to look very broadly worldwide in a very top-down way of saying, let's get these boundaries, let's get the data, let's see what they tell us about cities, a sort of inductive analysis of urban form. I recently worked on a third project with a large team of collaborators that almost inverted the logic of the previous study on its head, and instead taking a very bottom-up approach, doing this sort of large-scale analysis in sort of a more traditional small data kind of way. And I want to unpack this one a little bit because I think it sets up that call to arms around tool building with a really clear use case for it. So this third project both takes a step forward and kind of a step back from the previous work. And to frame it, I want to think a little bit about why it's important to benchmark and monitor urban design and transport features in cities. So creating healthier and more sustainable cities has become a global priority, integral to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the WHO's health equity goals in recent years. But what do those healthy and sustainable cities look like? So features like walkable streets, public transit, access to daily living needs and green spaces are all central to this idea of sustainability, but also being able to walk for physical activity to your daily living needs. Indicators of these kinds of features that support those active sustainable lifestyles allow planners to target interventions, identify areas of high access, low access, of inequitability. It allows planners to compare between cities for benchmarking, and over time for monitoring to better measure progress toward our stated goals. That sounds great. So why don't we have that everywhere already today? The problem is, as many of you in the room know all too well, those kind of indicators are really hard to create. And I'll highlight just 3 reasons why here. So first, these indicators are needed at both the local neighborhood scale, but also aggregated up to the city scale to allow for both within city and between city analyses. Second, the necessary data do not always exist. And when they do, they may not be publicly available or consistent. And third, the advanced spatial analysis required to do this kind of work takes a lot of technical expertise, expensive software, and lots of data. And those are obstacles everywhere, but they're particularly so in less resourced cities. And in combination, all of this thwarts the creation of consistent, reproducible indicators for healthier and more sustainable cities. So in this project, my collaborators and I argued that we need a new way forward. And to do this work, we leveraged an international network of collaborators for data sourcing and validation of our inputs and outputs. And that's particularly important when working with open data, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But we relied heavily on open data in this project to try to overcome some of the traditional obstacles. So we used the global human settlement layer, again, to get urban boundaries. We used OpenStreetMap data, again, to get street networks and amenity information. And we also use GTFS data to get public transit stops and frequencies. Once we had collected those data, in addition to some additional data being filled in and sourced from our local collaborators in our different study sites, we developed an open source software framework to process all of that data and then flexibly calculate indicators for any such study site anywhere in the world. And I want to take just a brief technical digression into that software framework to explain some of the stuff that we were doing here. So first off, we were defining neighborhoods here as the area within 1 kilometer walking of sample points that we generated across each urban area's populated areas. So this is kind of a technical specific definition of neighborhood for this project. And then within each of those walkable catchment areas, we estimated the population density and street intersection density. And for each sample point, we calculated the distance to the nearest healthy food market, convenience store, public transit stop, and public open space. And then a sample point was considered to have access to those features if you can walk to them within 500 meters. And that threshold is consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and represents approximately a 5-minute walk. Now, from that, we developed 2 composite indicators, a daily living score and a local walkability index. So the daily living score measures local access to a mixture of amenities, and the local walkability index is kind of our composite index of how walkable a neighborhood is. Once we had calculated all of that, we aggregated our sample points up to a 250-meter grid. That then allowed us to do within city and between city comparisons. So what did we find? This figure shows the local walkability index. Its color scale shows standard deviations with 0 as the global average. And I want to highlight that this is less of a story about high income versus low income country cities, and more a story about different models of urban planning, where consistently we see that inner cities tend to be more walkable and outer suburbs less so. So for example, high income Europe tended to perform relatively well, whereas high income US, Australian, and New Zealand cities tended to perform relatively poorly. So how do we explain this? This paper, along with 4 others, were recently published in a series in the Lancet Global Health. And one of our colleagues, Melanie Lowe, led a second study in this series that similarly found that Australian and US cities were the most likely to have policies that favor car use over active transport. And in particular, US cities have fallen further behind our modern global goals for public transit access. And we can see that reflected in their accessibility compared to other cities with different policy frameworks and cultural expectations around the world. Now, Sao Paulo and Bangkok offer another interesting tale along these lines. So on the left, Sao Paulo exhibits relatively good performance across the urban area. On the right, Bangkok exhibits poorer access outside of the central city. And this too matches what Melanie Lowe and her co-authors found, that Bangkok had the greatest policy gaps and limitations of any of the cities that we studied, while Sao Paulo's framework performed better than even those of many of the cities in high-income countries that we looked at. Now, there's a lot more to access than just the walking distance to goods and services. And if any of you live in Sao Paulo or Bangkok or have been there or studied there, you'll know that questions of safety, personal expectations of public space, quality of sidewalks, streetscapes, traffic conditions, all play an important role in this, but were not measured for the purposes of this study, but they do form an important component for follow-up research to think about that pedestrian experience, perceptions of safety and comfort, which we can come back to a bit at the end of this talk. Now, beyond those visuals, we were also trying to measure this idea of population access to amenities. So what proportion of the population has access to these daily living needs? Overall, in terms of walkable access to healthy food, we found that European cities tended to perform well. US cities tended to perform poorly, highlighted by, as one example, 70% of Bern's population had such access, but only 6% of Phoenix, Arizona's population did. In terms of walkable access to public transit stops, most cities had greater than 60% of their population within distance to those transit stops. But it's interesting to note here that 3 cities unexpectedly scored poorly. So that's Maiduguri, Nigeria, Mexico City, and Chennai, India. And this suggests the role of informal collective transportation in these cities, for which data to track them are lacking. And this is an important caveat to this kind of work, where certain places, and particularly places where there's more informality in either the urban form or in its amenities or in its transportation system, can often be illegible to the tools of urban informatics. That's more of a problem of our study design and our implementation, rather than a reflection of the real conditions on the ground in these places. And then lastly, the population with access to walkable public open space was overall high to any public open space, but dropped somewhat sharply for access to large public open spaces. So the latter being those kinds of places that are more amenable to physical activity and exercise, sporting, and so forth. Now, as a part of this project, we worked with a graphic designer to develop scorecards for each of these cities to show where it stands on both its policy frameworks and also on its spatial outcomes resulting from those policy frameworks. So this is an example of Sao Paulo, and you can see at the bottom of the scorecard how it performed across different policy indicators we were looking at. And in kind of the middle third, looking at how it scored on our spatial indicators. And across the top, we have a few statistics drawn just to kind of help contextualize size and economic conditions in each of these cities. So overall, the study developed this open source software framework. It worked with and generated open data in conjunction with local collaborators to explore to what extent different cities are providing a built environment conducive to healthy and sustainable living. We found that many people lack access to the physical features necessary for healthy and sustainable living. And kind of the takeaway of all of this is that there's an important opportunity here because open data and open source software have created for the first time this opportunity to both benchmark cities across each other, but also to monitor their progress over time. And our process in this project both began and ended with local knowledge. So from input data collection, hands-on with local collaborators on the ground in these different places, to validation efforts where we had local collaborators validating the quality of our open data, and verifying if we had an accurate snapshot of what was actually happening in the real world on the ground. And then collaborating with our local network all the way through output indicator interpretation. So trying to put that local context on it rather than just doing the study remotely and trying to make grander claims about these places without understanding, the local culture and economic conditions there. And this sort of collaborative work, we argue, is essential. Number one, when working internationally in this urban informatics framework. And secondly, even more so when working with open data that can have a lot of sampling biases and challenges with both completeness, timeliness, and accuracy. But we hope that these tools create a new opportunity to target evidence-based planning interventions, to monitor policy effects, and to try to harness lessons learned from peer cities. So this sequence of recent projects that I've presented are all predicated on tool building. And I'm going to conclude for just a few minutes here by trying to reflect on the centrality and importance of this in modern geospatial science. So our empirical and theoretical work in urban science, but in a lot of spatial sciences, has often been hamstrung by methodological challenges. And there's a central opportunity here in generating better tools for research and practice to understand, monitor, and design better mobility networks, better cities, better policy by measuring, monitoring. And there are a few specific opportunities in this space that I think tool building speaks to really nicely. So first, we need a better shared commons of software tools that I would argue ought to be led by academics to infuse those tools with the appropriate theory. And those tools should be well documented and reusable so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time that someone different wants to approach the same kind of research topic. There are both upstream and downstream benefits to doing so. So on the upstream side, it means that other people can contribute new features and improvements to your own research tools. And on the downstream side, it means that other people get to use your research tools rather than them having to reinvent them for themselves. And that's kind of the central idea of the commons, that we're all part of the same scientific endeavor, And the more that we can support each other, the better that our scientific work will collectively be. I think part of the goal here is to have better theory-infused informatics. And I've mentioned this a couple of times. Some examples of that would be better representation of real-world geometries. So, for example, incorporating 3 dimensions better, and incorporating better topologies, particularly non-planar topologies, into our spatial models. But this also entails things like representation of more diverse geographies. So better urban informatics for the global South, which too often are ignored because they're inconvenient for the default tools and techniques of urban informatics too much of the time. For researchers, we need new kinds of models for new kinds of data. So the old models don't necessarily work for a lot of the kinds of questions and the kinds of data that we have access to today. It's also incumbent upon us to make our code and data available when we're done with work. So posting code in public repositories like GitHub, sharing our data in open data repositories, all help support the goals of reusable science, not just reproducible, not just replicable, but this idea of reusable science. And it also helps support increasing engagement with new technologies like high-performance computing, big data infrastructure, and GPU computing, where a lot of people are doing interesting research on this space, and we can all kind of piggyback off of each other's work to keep improving the collective science commons. We also need better tools for practice. In particular, my context here is transportation planning practice, where new tools like Esri's City Engine, Calthorpe and Associates Urban Footprint have been doing really important and interesting work for better modeling of cities. And it's important to keep supporting and developing those tools because they make an enormous impact on our daily lived experiences in the urban forms that result. There are different ways that we as academics can support the urban commons. But what I would argue is the most important would be the decentralized many hands model. So community tool building where we collaborate around shared goals, which includes the all-important routine maintenance and ongoing evolution of mature projects. And we're kind of in that phase right now with the software framework I was just presenting in that third project, where we have version 1.0 of it. And it is now this ongoing work of maintenance, improvement, trying to make our documentation better and more legible to have other people come in and be able to reuse the tool. And I would say that work is just as difficult, but just as important as the initial development is. And this idea of the commons, so the software commons, the tool commons, the science commons, and the urban commons are key to those respective forms of informatics, where we have data gathered from, with, and by the people, and more tools for citizen science and advocacy for better connected and more sustainable cities. So I'm going to conclude there. It looks like we should have a few minutes for questions. I would like to thank you all again for letting me speak with you today, and I look forward to chatting in what time remains. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boeing, for your wonderful presentation. And I'm sure our audience are all applauding too. So this is really wonderful. And I also agree that these open source tools are very important for scientific advancements. And I also know that many of our GI science community members are making effort toward this direction by sharing open source tools and also sharing the source code of their research on GitHubs. So now we have some time for question and answers. So I see, okay, so there is one question from Lucas in the Q&A. So the question is, you already mentioned that there is more to workability and access than travel distance or travel time alone. Factors such as the safety, quality of sidewalks, behavior of car drivers, availability of clean air and shadowed areas, etc. How do you see the potential of urban informatics here? Yeah, this is the first part of the question. Maybe you can first answer the first part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I would like to chat about this more. So you specifically asked about the potential of urban informatics. And I would say the potential is huge, but we absolutely are not there yet. And if you just do a literature review of this kind of accessibility research, there are only some initial preliminary moves toward looking at this broader user experience side of accessibility because it's so hard to do because the data just by and large aren't there. I'd say the potential for urban informatics, it would probably be most strongly felt here on the machine learning side. So computer vision tasks of trying to automatically measure sidewalks, measure tree canopy coverage, better models of traffic conditions would help us get at least proxies of a lot of these user experience characteristics. You know, the other side of it is doing more traditional work that goes beyond the scope of urban informatics, doing qualitative or mixed methods research, or even just having instrumentation on these streets to be constantly measuring and monitoring the conditions there. The problem is, of course, we would probably gather from what I just said, none of these are inexpensive, none of these are easy to do, and none of these are purely urban informatics. So this is a good opportunity here, I think, for expanding its scope into more collaborative mixed methods work to think more broadly about how urban informatics is a single lens onto these questions and not the be-all, end-all.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. So I think you already answered the second part of Lucas, which is basically how to, or whether it is feasible to quantify and model these factors together. So so Lucas, if there is anything you would like to follow up, you could also raise your hand in the attendee, and I could also allow you to talk. And another question is from Jia Lu. They are asking about where do you deposit your data and the software you develop, and would be interested in exploring them. So I guess maybe for this question, we could maybe Geoff, you could email me like a URL. I know the famous OS MNext package. We can directly search it in Google, and we can find it. If there are any other repositories that if you would like to let the audience know, you can email me, and then I can follow up with our audience so that the audience can.
Yeah, certainly. You know what I can do, I'll send you an email both to my team's software framework for that accessibility modeling project, but I can also give you a link to the data repositories and the Dataverse where I have previously deposited my models and data. But just broadly, I guess, all of the software I deposit onto GitHub.
Wonderful. So next question is from Rongxiang Su. So thank you for your presentation, Dr. Boeing. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on improving the reusability of our own research in general.
Yeah, so I guess kind of thinking of, you know, specific tips to do it for researchers in general would include maybe 2 or 3 highest value things. One would be place your code on GitHub. You know, that's kind of like a fundamental thing to make it reusable. If people can't access it or they have to email you for it, they probably won't reuse it. The second thing would be that documentation is critical and so much harder to do right than you can ever really expect. And the reason for that is kind of the same thing that all of us in the room who also teach will often face, where when you become an expert in a subject that qualifies you to teach it, you also know so much about it that it's hard to remember what you didn't know, 10 years ago. It's hard to remember how to teach an intro class because you take so many things for granted that you struggle with stating the basics in a clear way for beginners. And that's what documentation is like. When you write documentation as a person who knows how this thing works inside and out. So what I would recommend to make tools more reusable is have other people try to install your software, have other people try to use it. If you're on GitHub, Pay attention to the issues that are being opened in your GitHub repo as people can't figure out what's going on, and just make sure that the documentation iteratively is being improved from there. And then the last thing is for reusability, make sure people know about it. So if you publish an article on that research, make sure you have a footnote at the end or an appendix where you explain where the software is and how people can reuse it, so that they would know to even search for it in the first place.
Thank you, Geoff. So our next question is from Professor Nila Lam. So she asks, what is the meaning of the grid index? And what about using the concept of resilience to help guide the need and use of this index?
That's a great question, and it's like an excellent leading question too, because that's kind of what I have some ongoing research on right now on the resilience side of it. So yeah, the grid index is a composite index with 3 components based on the theory that what you need to be grid-like are you need to have straight streets, you need to have 4-way intersections, and you need to have those straight streets all pointing in roughly the same directions as each other. It could be off, but it's basically there's 2 directions there. So what that means is that the grid index includes a proportion of 4-way intersections, the relative straightness of the streets relative to as the crow flies, and then lastly, the orientation entropy of the street network at whatever spatial scale you're looking at. And then those 3 in concert will suggest to you to what extent it's a true grid versus something approximating a true grid. Griddedness in and of itself, griddedness isn't the only way to achieve things like walkability or resilience or anything else. It's one of many ways, but what grids are really good at are, 1, providing a lot of connection points. So grids tend to have a lot more intersections, and each intersection tends to have more network edges that are adjacent at that point than other kinds of networks do. It's not the only way, but it's an easy way for urban design to do it right, and it's familiar. It's usually pretty easy to navigate, especially in a place like New York, where streets are numbered or lettered in a certain way that you're able to very easily figure out where you are and where you need to go. In my current research, I was mentioning resilience. So I've recently been simulating trips. So it's been simulating like a few billion trips across all of those urban street network models everywhere in the world that we had been talking about, with different disruptions happening to the street network. So either having a targeted attack on important nodes, having a flooding simulation on low-lying nodes, or having a random attack across the street network, and then understanding how these different components of street network design, including griddedness, help to predict both the resilience and the robustness of the street network to those different attacks.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. So I don't see any new question here. In fact, I also have a follow-up question related to the question of Nina. So, Geoff, I noticed that you first showed this very impressive, very nice tracked grid index map in your presentation. What I found is interesting is I noticed that in some of this, actually in many locations, there is like one very small bright spot, and then all the other areas are dark. So is that suggesting that in that one particular census tract, the grid index is much higher than the surrounding area?
That is what it indicates, and the interpretation of that has 2 dimensions. One dimension is that the grid index is correlated with the spatial unit size, because there's just a greater likelihood of more entropy as the area increases and starts to comprise more different designs developed at different times by different people. The second thing it indicates, what you're seeing there is really where urban areas are, in particular where the city cores are. What you'll most commonly see is like a bright yellow core at the center of an urban area, which, because of just the history of the United States, most of our central cities were laid out in the 19th century And because of that, they were laid out in the area where the spatial logic of the grid predominated. Surrounding them, you will see suburbs, usually from the 20th century, that are very ungrid-like. And then outside of that, you will see rural areas, often more mountainous areas where it's harder to build a city, less urbanized, larger spatial units, all correlated with lower griddedness.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And also all your visual presentations looks fantastic. I really like them.
Thanks.
So I see Shirun also has a question. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for delivering this excellent presentation. We only have 2 minutes left. I will keep it short. So now, with all of these increasing human activities in virtual space, so what do you think the future transport networks will be?
Oh, the $1 million question to end us off. Perfect. I will escape the question by showing humility and say that I'm not smart enough to know to really be able to predict the future, but it's a fascinating question, right? Because especially in the context of technology, everyone's been trying to predict the future, always. If you look back into the 1920s, people tried to predict what the future of the city would look like with cars. In the 1950s, people tried to predict what the future of the city would look like with flying cars. In the 90s, all the rage was now that the internet is here and we can all go offline, what happens when no one has a commute anymore? And then finally, 30 years later in 2021, everybody was working from home and it was the death of the city. And suddenly Idaho and suburbs and exurbs were getting all the population. The challenge with all these predictions is that it's almost always exogenous factors that determine what's going to happen next. And those exogenous factors are really hard to predict. So if we had a nice, stable future where people just worked from home, I would guess, that there will be less transportation like we've seen now. But in particular, there's an equity question there because it's white collar workers and higher income workers who've been able to shift their commutes more, while lower income workers have not been able to. So what I like to do on the city planning front is rather advocate for flexibility, where because we can't predict, what are the kinds of urban forms that we can build that will last for centuries, that will most flexibly support the most number of kinds of people and kinds of transportation and kinds of livelihoods when we just don't know what will come next.
Thank you very much. Yeah, excellent answer. Yeah. I think we also learned from COVID pandemic. So we even use sidewalks, street space for other purposes. Yeah. So I think flexibility is a wonderful thought for future planning. Yeah. Thank you.
That is an excellent question and excellent answer to finish our webinar. So please join me to thank our speaker, Dr. Geoff Boeing again. And also thank you all of you for your time for attending our webinar. And is there anything that Shirun or Chushen you would like to follow up?
No, I don't. Just maybe a quick question. So, yeah, excellent presentation. I use OSM NX a lot using to retrieve the data from OpenStreetMap, and I really like it. And so I noticed that some of the big tech companies, for example, Facebook, Google, Amazon, they're trying to work together somehow. I think they have a new initiative trying to create something building on top of OpenStreetMap. So I was thinking, like, based on your experiences and your work, what kind of things you think that would be nice to have, for example, from this big tech for support with the open source or developing some kind of standards that might be useful for the project that you are working on?
On the standard side, OpenStreetMap is pretty good right now because of their governance and the flexible definitions they have for infrastructure around the world. I think the biggest value adds would be keeping its database up to date. So it's often very hard to tell if someone digitized a feature 10 years ago. Is it still there now? Did it change? Did the land use change? Adding in things like building footprint is really valuable. Microsoft's been doing a lot of interesting work on that in the past few years. So I think that just kind of fleshing out the database to avoid some of those sampling biases. And then secondly, having it be repetitive to keep things up to date would be hugely beneficial.
Yeah, it would be nice to they can keep the database and then somehow also openly accessible. I know that AWS have the kind of historical data for OpenStreetMap, but still it's kind of barrier because not all the users know how to read their database. So yeah, but hopefully in the future they will make it easier, and then so more people can contribute to the data and also open source community.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all. So look forward to seeing you in our following up UCGS webinars. Thank you. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.